Nathaniel Johnson stepped into the library, his senses immediately captivated by the distinct aroma of aged books and the palpable tranquility that permeated the air. The atmosphere was a stark contrast to the high-pressure corporate world he had been desperate to escape. As he walked through the entrance, his eyes scanned the rows of bookshelves, each lined with countless volumes that seemed to whisper stories of their own. The floorboards creaked softly under his feet as he moved deeper into the library. The sound of shuffling papers and the occasional rustle of turning pages filled the air. Nathaniel noticed a young woman, her back turned to him, carefully organizing books on a nearby shelf. This was Zoe Carter, though Nathaniel didn't know her name yet. As if sensing his presence, Zoe turned around. Her eyes met Nathaniel's, and a shy smile spread across her face. "Welcome to Maplewood Library," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper but warm and inviting. "Can I help you find anything?" Nathaniel, momentarily caught off guard by her friendliness, returned the smile. "I'm just browsing, thank you," he replied. "I'm new to town and thought I'd explore a bit." Zoe's eyes lit up with interest. "Well, you've certainly come to the right place for exploration," she said, gesturing to the shelves around them. "We might be small, but we have quite the collection here." As they began to talk, Nathaniel found himself drawn into a conversation about literature. Zoe's enthusiasm was infectious as she spoke about her favorite authors and genres. Nathaniel, an avid reader himself, found her passion for books both refreshing and inspiring. "Have you read To Kill a Mockingbird?" Zoe asked, pulling the book from a nearby shelf. "It's one of my all-time favorites." Nathaniel nodded, a fond expression crossing his face. "Harper Lee's masterpiece. I remember reading it for the first time in high school. It left quite an impression." Their conversation flowed effortlessly from one book to another. Nathaniel found himself sharing his own literary preferences, surprised at how easy it was to open up to this stranger. Zoe listened intently, her eyes sparkling with genuine interest. As they talked, Nathaniel couldn't help but notice the state of the library. While clearly loved, it showed signs of age and neglect. Paint peeled from the walls in places, and some of the furniture had seen better days. Despite this, there was an undeniable charm to the place. Over the next few weeks, Nathaniel found himself returning to the library regularly. Each visit deepened his connection with Zoe and strengthened his affection for the quaint building that housed so much knowledge and history. During one of his visits, Nathaniel broached the subject of the library's condition. "Have you ever thought about organizing events to attract more people to the library?" he asked Zoe. "It could help revitalize the place." Zoe's face lit up at the suggestion. "I've had so many ideas, but we've always lacked the resources to implement them," she admitted. "What did you have in mind?" Nathaniel, drawing from his business experience, began to outline potential events: author readings, book clubs, children's story times, and even small concerts or art exhibitions. As he spoke, he noticed Zoe watching him intently. Her eyes filled with a mixture of excitement and something else, something that made his heart beat a little faster. "That sounds wonderful," Zoe said softly when he finished. "But it would take a lot of work and resources we don't have." Nathaniel hesitated for a moment before making a decision that would change both their lives. "What if I helped?" he offered. "I have some experience in event planning and, well, I'd like to see this place thrive." The look Zoe gave him was filled with gratitude and something more, a spark of attraction that mirrored Nathaniel's own growing feelings. As their eyes met, both felt the beginnings of a connection that went beyond their shared love of books. Little did they know that this moment marked the beginning of a journey that would not only transform the library, but also challenge their perceptions, test their resolve, and ultimately reshape the entire community of Maplewood. The Maplewood Community Center buzzed with activity as residents filed in for the town meeting. The future of the library was on the agenda, and the room was filled with a mix of anticipation and concern. Nathaniel and Zoe sat side by side at the front, ready to present their ideas for revitalizing the beloved institution. Mayor Thompson called the meeting to order, his voice echoing through the packed room. As you all know, our library has been struggling for some time now. We're here today to discuss its future and some proposed changes. Nathaniel stood up, feeling the weight of dozens of eyes upon him. He cleared his throat and began to outline the plans he and Zoe had developed. "We believe the library can become more than just a place to borrow books," he explained. "We envision it as a cultural hub for Maplewood, a place where people can come together to learn, create, and connect." As Nathaniel spoke, he could see faces in the crowd shifting from skepticism to interest. He detailed plans for author readings, workshops, and community events that would breathe new life into the old building. When Zoe took over, her passion was evident in every word. "The library has always been at the heart of Maplewood," she said. "With these changes, we can ensure it remains that way for generations to come." As the presentation concluded, a moment of silence hung in the air. Then, slowly at first, applause began to build. Soon the room was filled with the sound of clapping and excited chatter. Residents stood up one by one to voice their support. Mrs. Jenkins, the retired schoolteacher, spoke of the importance of having a vibrant library for the town's children. Mr. Ramirez, owner of the local bakery, offered to provide refreshments for future events. The meeting ended on a high note, with the community rallying behind Nathaniel and Zoe's vision. As people filed out, many stopped to shake their hands and offer words of encouragement. Among the last to approach was an elderly woman who moved slowly but purposefully towards them. Zoe's face lit up with recognition. "Grandma," she exclaimed, embracing the woman warmly. Nathaniel watched as Zoe introduced him to her grandmother, Margaret Carter. Despite her advanced age, Margaret's eyes were sharp and intelligent as she assessed Nathaniel. "So you're the young man who's been helping my granddaughter," Margaret said, her voice strong despite her frail appearance. "It's about time someone recognized the value of our library." Margaret turned to address both of them. "You should know," she began, her voice taking on a solemn tone. "This library means more to our family than most people realize." Zoe looked at her grandmother curiously. "What do you mean, Grandma?" Margaret glanced around, ensuring they were alone before continuing. "Your great-grandfather, Thomas Carter, was instrumental in founding this library," she explained. "It was during a time when not everyone in town had access to books and education. He believed knowledge should be available to all, regardless of their background or social status." Nathaniel listened intently, realizing there was more to the story of Maplewood's library than he had initially thought. Margaret continued, her eyes misting with memories. "It wasn't an easy fight. There were those in town who opposed the idea, who wanted to keep knowledge and power in the hands of a select few. But Thomas persevered. He rallied support, donated his own books, and even used the family savings to secure the building." Zoe gasped softly, never having heard this part of her family history before. "Why didn't you ever tell me this, Grandma?" Margaret patted Zoe's hand gently. "Some stories are best saved for the right moment, dear. And now, seeing you fight for the library just as your great-grandfather did, I knew it was time." The revelation added a new layer of significance to their project. It wasn't just about saving a building or preserving books. It was about honoring a legacy of inclusivity and education. Inspired by Margaret's story, Nathaniel and Zoe organized a community storytelling night at the library. The event was a resounding success, with residents sharing personal anecdotes, local legends, and family histories. As the evening progressed, the atmosphere in the library was one of warmth and unity. However, beneath the surface of conviviality, undercurrents of tension began to emerge. Whispered comments and pointed glances hinted at deeper unresolved issues within the community. The event concluded on a high note, but as people were leaving, Nathaniel overheard a conversation that made him pause. Two older men were speaking in hushed tones, their words laced with suspicion. "Who does this outsider think he is, coming in and changing things?" one muttered. "I don't trust him," the other replied. "People like him always have hidden agendas." Nathaniel felt a chill run down his spine. He realized that while many in Maplewood welcomed the changes, others viewed his presence with distrust and resentment. The path ahead, he understood, would not be as smooth as he had hoped. The initial excitement surrounding the library's revitalization began to wane as underlying tensions in Maplewood surfaced. Nathaniel, who had been riding high on the wave of community support, found himself abruptly confronted by a group of disgruntled residents one afternoon outside the library. "Mr. Johnson!" a stern voice called out as Nathaniel approached the building. He turned to see George Hawkins, a prominent local business owner, flanked by several other townspeople. Their expressions were far from friendly. "We need to talk about what you're doing here in Maplewood," George said, his tone leaving no room for argument. Nathaniel straightened his posture, sensing the hostility. "Of course, Mr. Hawkins. What seems to be the problem?" George's eyes narrowed. "The problem is you, Mr. Johnson. You waltz into our town throwing money around, trying to change things. What are your real intentions?" The accusation caught Nathaniel off guard. He hadn't expected such direct opposition. "My intentions are exactly what I've stated, to help revitalize the library and contribute to the community," he replied, keeping his voice level. Another man, Tom Foster, stepped forward. "We've seen your type before. Rich outsiders who think they can buy their way into our town, change things to suit themselves, and then leave when they get bored." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the small crowd. Nathaniel felt a sinking feeling in his stomach as he realized how deep the mistrust ran. Just then, Zoe emerged from the library, drawn by the commotion. Her eyes widened as she took in the scene. "What's going on here?" she asked, moving to stand beside Nathaniel. George turned his attention to Zoe. "Stay out of this, Zoe. This doesn't concern you." "It absolutely concerns me," Zoe retorted, her voice steady despite the tension. "Nathaniel has done nothing but help our library and our community. Why are you attacking him?" Tom scoffed. "Help? He's changing the very fabric of our town, and you're just going along with it, blinded by his charm and his money." Zoe's face flushed with anger. "That's not fair. Everything we've done has been for the benefit of Maplewood. We've been transparent about our plans from the start." The confrontation was drawing attention. Other townspeople began to gather, some looking concerned, others curious. Nathaniel could see the divide forming, those who supported the changes and those who viewed them with suspicion. "Look," Nathaniel said, trying to defuse the situation. "I understand your concerns. I'm not here to change Maplewood's identity. I'm here because I believe in what this town represents, and I want to contribute positively to its future." His words seemed to fall on deaf ears. George stepped closer, his voice low and threatening. "We're watching you, Johnson. One wrong move, and you'll find out just how unwelcome you really are." With that, the group dispersed, leaving Nathaniel and Zoe standing alone in front of the library. The other onlookers slowly drifted away, whispering among themselves. Zoe turned to Nathaniel, her face a mix of anger and concern. "I'm so sorry, Nathaniel. I had no idea some people felt this way." Nathaniel shook his head, his mind racing. "It's not your fault, Zoe. I should have anticipated this. Change is never easy, especially in a close-knit community like Maplewood." They retreated into the library, seeking refuge from the prying eyes outside. As they sat in the quiet reading area, Nathaniel couldn't shake the feeling that he had underestimated the complexity of his situation in Maplewood. "Maybe I should step back," he mused aloud. "The last thing I want is to cause division in the town." Zoe looked at him sharply. "No, you can't give up now. We've made so much progress. The library needs you." "I need you," she added softly, then looked away, seemingly surprised by her own admission. Nathaniel felt a surge of emotion at her words, but it was tempered by the reality of their situation. "I need to think about this, Zoe. I came here looking for peace, not conflict." As he left the library that evening, Nathaniel felt the weight of the town's scrutiny on his shoulders. He retreated to his rented cottage on the outskirts of Maplewood, his mind a whirlwind of conflicting thoughts and emotions. Zoe, left alone in the library, felt torn between her growing feelings for Nathaniel and her loyalty to the town she'd called home all her life. The confrontation had shaken her, forcing her to see Maplewood in a new light. As night fell over the small town, both Nathaniel and Zoe grappled with difficult questions. Could they bridge the divide that was forming in Maplewood? And more importantly, was their budding relationship strong enough to withstand the pressure? The once peaceful atmosphere of Maplewood now felt charged with tension, the future of the library project and their relationship hanging in the balance. As the days passed, the tension in Maplewood continued to simmer. Nathaniel, feeling the weight of the town's scrutiny, knew he couldn't avoid the truth any longer. He decided it was time to be honest with Zoe about his past and his family's history. On a crisp autumn evening, Nathaniel invited Zoe for a walk in the park adjacent to the library. The fallen leaves crunched beneath their feet as they strolled in silence, both sensing the gravity of the moment. Finally, Nathaniel spoke. "Zoe, there's something I need to tell you about my family and our connection to Maplewood." Zoe looked at him, her eyes filled with concern. "What is it, Nathaniel?" Taking a deep breath, Nathaniel began to reveal the truth. "My family's fortune, it wasn't built on honest business practices. My great-grandfather, Alexander Johnson, made his money through discriminatory lending practices and predatory real estate deals." Zoe's eyes widened in shock, but she remained silent, allowing Nathaniel to continue. "Many of those deals happened right here in Maplewood," Nathaniel explained, his voice heavy with regret. "He took advantage of people who were already struggling, especially minority communities. He acquired properties at unfair prices and pushed people out of their homes." The weight of his words hung in the air between them. Zoe's face was a mixture of disbelief and disappointment. "Why didn't you tell me this before?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Nathaniel ran a hand through his hair, frustration evident in his gesture. "I was ashamed, Zoe. I came to Maplewood to escape my family's legacy, to find some peace. But when I saw the library and met you, I thought maybe I could do some good, start to make amends for my family's past wrongs." Zoe took a step back, her mind reeling from the revelation. "So all of this, the library project, your involvement in the community, it's just about easing your conscience?" "No," Nathaniel exclaimed, reaching out to her but stopping short of touching her. "It started that way, perhaps, but it's become so much more. This town, the library, you've all come to mean so much to me." Zoe shook her head, tears forming in her eyes. "I don't know what to think, Nathaniel. I feel like I don't know you at all." Just then they heard a gasp behind them. Turning, they saw Zoe's grandmother, Margaret, standing a few feet away, her face pale with shock. "I couldn't help but overhear," Margaret said, her voice trembling. "Johnson, I should have made the connection sooner." Zoe rushed to her grandmother's side, supporting her as she seemed to sway on her feet. "Grandma, what are you talking about?" Margaret's eyes locked onto Nathaniel, a mixture of pain and anger in her gaze. "Your great-grandfather, Alexander Johnson, he's the reason our family lost everything." The revelation hit Zoe like a physical blow. She turned to Nathaniel, her eyes now filled with hurt and betrayal. "Is this true?" Nathaniel nodded solemnly. "It's likely. My family's actions affected many in this town." Margaret straightened up, her voice gaining strength as she spoke. "Your great-grandfather forced us to sell our farm for a fraction of its worth. We had no choice. It was that or face complete ruin. That farm had been in our family for generations." Zoe felt as if the ground was shifting beneath her feet. Everything she thought she knew about Nathaniel, about her own family's history, was changing in an instant. "I had no idea," Nathaniel said, his voice filled with genuine remorse. "I'm so sorry for what my family did to yours." Margaret's eyes flashed with anger. "Sorry doesn't change the past, young man. Your family's fortune was built on the suffering of others." Zoe, torn between her feelings for Nathaniel and her loyalty to her family, felt overwhelmed. "I need some time to process all of this," she said, her voice shaking. "Nathaniel, I think you should go." Nathaniel nodded, understanding the need for space. As he turned to leave, he looked back at Zoe one last time. "I never meant to hurt you or anyone else in this town. I hope you can believe that." As Nathaniel walked away, Zoe and Margaret stood in silence, the weight of history and hidden truths pressing down on them. The park, once a place of peace and new beginnings, now felt tainted by the ghosts of the past. Zoe led her grandmother to a nearby bench, her mind racing with questions. As they sat down, Margaret began to share more about their family's history and the impact the Johnsons had on Maplewood. With each revelation, Zoe felt her world shifting, her perspective on both her town and Nathaniel forever altered. As night fell over Maplewood, three souls grappled with the consequences of long-buried secrets finally brought to light. The future of their relationships, and perhaps the town itself, hung in the balance, awaiting the dawn of a new day and the decisions it would bring. In the days following the revelation, Maplewood was abuzz with whispers and speculation. The truth about Nathaniel's family history spread quickly, deepening the divide in the community. Nathaniel, isolated in his rented cottage, grappled with the fallout of his confession and the pain he had caused Zoe and her family. After days of internal struggle, Nathaniel made a decision. He couldn't change the past, but perhaps he could use his resources to make amends. With renewed determination, he drafted a comprehensive plan to address the historical injustices caused by his family. Early one morning, Nathaniel made his way to the library, hoping to find Zoe. He found her organizing books, her movements mechanical, her eyes distant. "Zoe," he called softly, causing her to start. "I know you probably don't want to see me, but please, hear me out." Zoe turned to face him, her expression guarded. "What is it, Nathaniel?" Nathaniel took a deep breath. "I've been thinking a lot about what happened, about my family's history with Maplewood. I want to make things right, not just for you and your family, but for everyone my ancestors hurt." He proceeded to outline his plan, establishing a community fund to support local businesses, creating scholarships for underprivileged students, and investing in affordable housing projects. The cornerstone of his proposal was a substantial endowment for the library, ensuring its long-term sustainability and expansion. "I know this doesn't erase the past," Nathaniel said, his voice earnest, "but I hope it can be a step towards a better future for Maplewood." Zoe listened silently, her face a mask of conflicting emotions. When Nathaniel finished, she spoke softly. "Your plan, it sounds wonderful. But Nathaniel, how can I trust that this isn't just another way to ease your conscience? How do I know you're genuinely committed to Maplewood?" Nathaniel's shoulders sagged. "I understand your doubts, Zoe. I can only prove my intentions through actions, not words. I'm prepared to stay here, to work alongside the community, to see this through. This isn't about easing my conscience anymore. It's about doing what's right." Zoe's expression softened slightly. "I appreciate your honesty, Nathaniel, but I need time to think about this. And it's not just about me. The whole town needs to be involved in this decision." As they stood in silence, the library door opened. Margaret entered, her eyes narrowing at the sight of Nathaniel. "What's he doing here?" she asked sharply. Zoe quickly explained Nathaniel's proposal. Margaret listened intently, her expression unreadable. When Zoe finished, Margaret turned to Nathaniel. "Young man, your family has a lot to answer for, but I've lived long enough to know that the sins of the father aren't always the sins of the son. If you're serious about making amends, you've got a long, hard road ahead of you." Nathaniel nodded solemnly. "I understand, Mrs. Carter. I'm prepared to do whatever it takes." Margaret's stern expression softened slightly. Well, that's a start. But you'll need to convince more than just us. This town has a long memory. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of George Hawkins and several other townspeople. Word of Nathaniel's presence at the library had spread quickly. George's face was thunderous. So the truth comes out. You're not just an outsider, you're the heir to the family that nearly ruined this town. Nathaniel stood his ground. Yes, my family caused great harm to Maplewood. I'm here to take responsibility for that and to make amends. He proceeded to explain his plan to the gathered crowd. As he spoke, the reactions varied. Some faces showed skepticism, others hope, and still others remained angry. When Nathaniel finished, an uncomfortable silence fell over the group. Finally, Tom Foster spoke up. It's a nice gesture, Johnson, but how do we know this isn't just a PR stunt? How can we trust you? Before Nathaniel could respond, Zoe stepped forward. I understand everyone's concerns. I had them too. But I think we owe it to ourselves and to Maplewood to at least consider this proposal. Nathaniel is offering us a chance to heal old wounds and build a better future for our town. Her words seemed to have an impact. The crowd began to murmur, discussing the possibilities. Margaret, who had been silent, suddenly spoke. I've lived through the harm the Johnsons caused, but I've also seen this town pull together in times of crisis. Perhaps this is our chance to turn a dark chapter of our history into something positive. As the discussion continued, it became clear that while some were willing to give Nathaniel's plan a chance, others remained deeply skeptical. The town was at a crossroads, faced with a decision that would shape its future. Nathaniel, standing amidst the debate he had sparked, realized that this was just the beginning. Winning back the trust of Maplewood, and of Zoe, would be a long and challenging journey. But as he looked around at the passionate faces of the townspeople, he felt a glimmer of hope. For the first time in his life, he was exactly where he needed to be, ready to face the consequences of his family's past and work towards a better future. The weeks following Nathaniel's proposal were tumultuous for Maplewood. The town had become a hotbed of debate, with residents divided over whether to accept Nathaniel's offer of restitution. The library, once a quiet sanctuary, now found itself at the center of this storm. One evening, as Zoe was locking up the library, she noticed a group of people gathered outside. As she approached, she recognized George Hawkins and several others who had been vocal opponents of Nathaniel's plan. "Zoe," George called out, his voice tense. "We need to talk about what's happening to our town." Zoe steeled herself, sensing the confrontation ahead. "What's on your mind, George?" George stepped forward, his face set in grim lines. "This whole situation with Johnson is tearing Maplewood apart. We can't let him buy his way into our good graces. It's time to put an end to this." "What are you suggesting?" Zoe asked, a note of apprehension in her voice. "We're calling for an emergency town meeting," Tom Foster chimed in. "We want to vote on whether to accept Johnson's money and whether he should be allowed to stay in Maplewood at all." Zoe felt a surge of frustration. "You can't just force someone to leave town. Nathaniel has every right to be here, regardless of his family history." "We'll see about that," George replied ominously. "In the meantime, we're shutting down this library project. No more events, no more renovations. Not until we sort this out." Zoe's eyes widened in shock. "You can't do that! The library is town property, not yours to control." George's expression hardened. "Watch us. We've already spoken to the mayor. He agrees that all library activities should be suspended until this matter is resolved." As if to emphasize their point, one of the men in the group stepped forward and began placing "closed until further notice" signs on the library doors. Zoe felt a wave of panic. "This is wrong. You can't just shut down a public institution because you're angry at one person." But her protests fell on deaf ears. The group dispersed, leaving Zoe alone in front of the library, the closure signs a stark reminder of how quickly things had spiraled out of control. The news of the library's closure spread rapidly through Maplewood. The next day, a crowd gathered in front of the building, a mix of angry protesters and confused patrons. Nathaniel, hearing about the closure, rushed to the scene. He found Zoe standing on the library steps trying to calm the growing crowd. "Zoe!" he called out, pushing through the throng. "What's happening?" Zoe turned to him, her face a mask of worry and frustration. "They've shut down the library, Nathaniel. They're using it as leverage to force a town vote on your proposal and your presence here." Nathaniel felt a surge of guilt. "This is all my fault. I never meant for things to go this far." Just then, Margaret appeared, making her way through the crowd with surprising agility for her age. "This has gone on long enough," she declared, her voice carrying over the murmurs of the crowd. "Nathaniel, Zoe, come with me. It's time we settled this once and for all." As they followed Margaret away from the library, Nathaniel turned to Zoe. "I'm so sorry about all of this. Maybe it would be better if I just left town." Zoe, despite her own turmoil, found herself reaching for his hand. "No, Nathaniel. Running away won't solve anything. We need to face this together." Their eyes met, a moment of understanding passing between them. Whatever happened next, they would confront it side by side. Margaret led them to her home, a quaint house filled with generations of memories. As they settled in her living room, she fixed them both with a stern gaze. "Now," she began, "it's time for some hard truths and tough decisions. This town is at a breaking point, and you two are at the heart of it. We need to find a way forward, not just for the library, but for all of Maplewood." As Margaret began to speak, Nathaniel and Zoe listened intently, knowing that the path ahead would be challenging but necessary. The future of the library, their relationship, and the entire town hung in the balance, awaiting the outcome of this crucial conversation. As Nathaniel and Zoe sat in Margaret's living room, the air was thick with tension. Margaret moved to an old oak cabinet in the corner, retrieving a worn, leather-bound book. She returned to her seat, her fingers tracing the cover with a mix of reverence and trepidation. "There's something you both need to know," Margaret began, her voice steady despite the gravity of the moment. "Something that connects our families in ways you couldn't imagine." Zoe leaned forward, her curiosity piqued. "What do you mean, Grandma?" Margaret opened the book, revealing yellowed pages filled with handwritten entries. "This is my father's journal. He documented everything that happened during those dark days when the Johnsons were at the height of their power in Maplewood." Nathaniel shifted uncomfortably but remained silent, his eyes fixed on the journal. "But there's more to the story than just the harm done," Margaret continued. She flipped through the pages until she found what she was looking for. "Here, read this entry." Zoe took the journal, her eyes scanning the faded handwriting. As she read, her expression changed from curiosity to shock. "Grandma, is this true?" Margaret nodded solemnly. "Every word." Nathaniel, unable to contain his curiosity, spoke up. "What does it say?" Zoe looked up, her eyes meeting Nathaniel's. "It says that your great-grandfather, Alexander Johnson, had a change of heart near the end of his life. He tried to make amends for what he'd done." Nathaniel's brow furrowed in confusion. "What? I've never heard anything about this." Margaret took back the journal, her voice taking on a storyteller's cadence. Alexander Johnson was a hard man, driven by greed and ambition. But in his final years, something changed. Maybe it was guilt. Maybe it was fear of judgment in the afterlife. Whatever the reason, he reached out to my father in secret. She turned the page, continuing the story. Alexander wanted to make things right, but he was afraid of the backlash from his business partners and his own family. So he and my father devised a plan. Alexander would gradually transfer funds and property deeds to a trust, managed in secret by my father. The goal was to eventually return what had been taken from the people of Maplewood. Zoe and Nathaniel listened in stunned silence as Margaret revealed how the plan had begun to unfold. Small, anonymous donations to struggling families. Mysteriously forgiven debts. properties quietly returned to their original owners. But before the plan could be fully realized, Alexander died suddenly, Margaret said, her voice tinged with regret. And with him, the secret of the trust died too. My father tried to continue the work, but without access to the Johnson fortune, he could only do so much. Nathaniel sat back, his mind reeling. I had no idea. My family never spoke of anything like this. Margaret nodded. I imagine they wouldn't. It would have gone against everything they thought they knew about Alexander. Zoe, processing this new information, turned to her grandmother. Why are you telling us this now? Margaret's eyes held a mixture of sadness and determination. Because history is repeating itself. Nathaniel, like your great-grandfather, you're trying to make amends. But unlike him, you have the chance to see it through. She turned to Zoe. And you, my dear, have the chance to finish what your great-grandfather started. To help heal the wounds of the past and build a better future for Maplewood. The room fell silent as the weight of this revelation settled over them. Nathaniel was the first to speak, his voice thick with emotion. I don't know what to say. This changes everything. Zoe reached out, taking Nathaniel's hand in hers. It doesn't change what happened in the past, but it does change how we move forward. Margaret smiled softly at their joined hands. Exactly. The question now is, what will you do with this knowledge? Nathaniel straightened, a new resolve in his eyes. We need to tell the town, all of it. No more secrets, no more hidden histories. It's time for the full truth to come out. Zoe nodded in agreement. But how? The town is already so divided. Will they even listen? Margaret stood, her frail frame belying the strength in her voice. They'll listen because we'll make them listen. It's time for Maplewood to confront its past and decide its future. As they prepared to leave, ready to face the town with their newfound knowledge, Nathaniel turned to Margaret. Thank you for sharing this with us. I know it couldn't have been easy. Margaret's eyes softened. The truth rarely is, young man, but it's always necessary. With that, they stepped out into the fading light of day, the journal tucked safely under Margaret's arm. They walked towards the town center, knowing that the next few hours would determine the fate of Maplewood, the library, and their own intertwined destinies. The Maplewood Community Center was packed to capacity, the air thick with tension and anticipation. Word had spread quickly about an emergency town meeting, and it seemed every resident had turned out to witness what promised to be a pivotal moment in the town's history. Mayor Thompson stood at the podium, trying to maintain order as murmurs and whispers rippled through the crowd. Folks, please settle down, he called out, his voice straining to be heard. We're here to address the recent controversies surrounding the library project and certain revelations about our town's history. As the room quieted, Nathaniel, Zoe, and Margaret made their way to the front. Their entrance caused a new wave of murmurs to sweep through the audience. Mayor Thompson cleared his throat. We have some unexpected speakers tonight. Mr. Johnson, Miss Carter, and Mrs. Carter have asked to address the town. Given the circumstances, I believe it's in everyone's interest to hear them out. Nathaniel stepped up to the podium first, his face a mask of determination. Good evening, everyone. I know many of you are angry, confused, and hurt by the recent revelations about my family's history in Maplewood. You have every right to be. But there's more to the story, and it's time you heard all of it. He began to recount the tale Margaret had shared of Alexander Johnson's change of heart and the secret trust established with Zoe's great-grandfather. As he spoke, the room fell into a stunned silence. When Nathaniel finished, Zoe took his place at the podium. What you've just heard might seem unbelievable, but we have proof. She held up her great-grandfather's journal. This journal documents everything: the plan, the secret donations, the attempts to right the wrongs of the past. Margaret stepped forward then, her voice strong despite her age. I've kept this secret for decades, believing the time was never right to reveal it. But seeing history repeat itself, watching our town tear itself apart over past wrongs and present attempts at restitution, I knew it was time for the truth to come out. The community center erupted into chaos as people began to shout questions and accusations. Mayor Thompson frantically tried to restore order. Amidst the commotion, George Hawkins pushed his way to the front. "This is ridiculous," he shouted. "You expect us to believe this convenient little story? It's clearly a ploy to manipulate the town into accepting Johnson's blood money." Zoe faced him squarely. "It's not a story, Mr. Hawkins. It's documented history. You're welcome to examine the journal yourself." As George sputtered, unable to form a coherent rebuttal, a new voice rose from the crowd. It was Tom Foster, who had been one of Nathaniel's harshest critics. "I'd like to say something," Tom said, his voice quieter than usual but carrying clearly in the now hushed room. He made his way to the front, standing beside Nathaniel and Zoe. "I've been one of the loudest voices against Mr. Johnson and this whole library project," Tom began. "I was sure he was here to exploit our town just like his family did in the past. But hearing this, it changes things." Tom turned to face the crowd. "We've all been holding on to anger and resentment for so long. Maybe it's time we considered the possibility of healing, of moving forward." His words seemed to resonate with many in the audience. The atmosphere in the room began to shift, tension giving way to a cautious hope. Mayor Thompson seized the moment. "Folks, we have a choice to make. Do we continue to let the past define us, or do we take this opportunity to shape a new future for Maplewood?" Nathaniel stepped forward once more. "I know my original proposal seemed like an attempt to buy your forgiveness. But now, knowing the full story, I'd like to propose something different. Let's work together, all of us, to create a plan that honors the original intent of that secret trust. A plan that truly serves the needs of everyone in Maplewood." Zoe joined him. "The library can be more than just a building with books. It can be a symbol of our town's resilience, a place where we preserve our true history and build a better future." As they finished speaking, the room fell silent. The residents of Maplewood looked at each other, decades of misunderstanding and resentment hanging in the balance against the possibility of reconciliation and progress. Slowly, hands began to raise. People stood up, voicing their support, asking questions, offering ideas. The meeting that had started with anger and division was transforming into a collaborative discussion about Maplewood's future. As the night wore on, it became clear that while not everyone was fully convinced, a significant shift had occurred. The town was taking its first tentative steps towards healing old wounds and embracing new possibilities. Nathaniel and Zoe exchanged a look of cautious optimism. They knew there was still a long road ahead, but for the first time since the controversy began, it felt like Maplewood was moving in the right direction. Together. In the weeks following the tumultuous town meeting, Maplewood began to undergo a subtle but significant transformation. The initial shock of the revelations had given way to a cautious optimism, as residents started to embrace the possibility of change and reconciliation. The library, which had been at the center of the controversy, became a symbol of this new beginning. With the closure order lifted, Zoe threw herself into revitalizing the space, now with the full support of the town council and a growing number of volunteers. One sunny morning, as Zoe was organizing a new shipment of books, she heard the library door open. Looking up, she saw her grandmother, Margaret, slowly making her way in, leaning on her cane. "Grandma," Zoe said, rushing to help her. "What are you doing here?" Margaret's eyes twinkled with determination. "I'm here to help, of course. It's about time I did more than just tell old stories." As they worked side by side, sorting books and discussing plans for the library's future, Margaret's presence seemed to inspire others. Throughout the day, more and more townspeople dropped by, offering to lend a hand or simply to see the changes taking place. Meanwhile, Nathaniel had taken on the challenge of transparency with vigor. He set up an office in town where he worked diligently on creating a comprehensive plan for the use of his family's funds to benefit Maplewood. His door was always open, and he made a point of involving as many townspeople as possible in the decision-making process. One afternoon, as Nathaniel was poring over some proposals, he was surprised by a knock on his door. Looking up, he saw George Hawkins standing there, looking uncomfortable but resolute. "Mr. Hawkins," Nathaniel said, rising to greet him. "Please come in." George entered hesitantly. "Johnson, I owe you an apology. I was so caught up in old grudges that I couldn't see the good you were trying to do." Nathaniel shook his head. "Your suspicion was understandable, given the history. I'm just glad we have a chance to move forward now." As they talked, George began to open up about his own family's struggles in the past and his fears for the town's future. By the end of their conversation, George had not only offered his support, but also valuable insights into the needs of the local business community. Back at the library, Zoe was closing up for the day when she discovered an old, dust-covered box tucked away in a corner of the archives. Curious, she opened it to find a collection of photographs and documents dating back to the town's early days. Among the papers, she found a faded photograph that made her gasp. It showed her great-grandfather standing next to a man she recognized from old portraits as Alexander Johnson. Despite the formal pose, there was an undeniable sense of camaraderie between the two men. Zoe carefully took the photo and made her way to Nathaniel's office. When she showed him the picture, his eyes widened in surprise. "This is incredible," he said softly, studying the image. "It's physical proof of the connection between our families." Zoe nodded, a thoughtful expression on her face. "I think we should display this in the library, along with the journal and other historical documents. It's time for Maplewood to embrace all aspects of its history." Nathaniel agreed, and together they began to plan a new exhibition that would tell the full story of Maplewood's past, including both the difficult truths and the attempts at redemption. As word of the upcoming exhibition spread, it sparked renewed interest in the town's history. Residents began coming forward with their own family stories and heirlooms, eager to contribute to a more complete narrative of Maplewood's past. The atmosphere in the town was changing. Where there had once been division and suspicion, there was now a growing sense of unity and shared purpose. It wasn't perfect. There were still those who harbored doubts and resentments, but the shift was undeniable. One evening, as Zoe and Nathaniel walked through the park after a long day of work, they paused to take in the sight of the library, its windows glowing warmly in the twilight. "Did you ever imagine it would turn out like this?" Zoe asked, leaning slightly against Nathaniel. He shook his head, a smile playing on his lips. "Never, but I'm glad it did." As they stood there, hand in hand, they both felt a sense of hope for the future, not just for themselves, but for the entire town of Maplewood. The journey of healing and reconciliation was far from over, but they were on the right path, moving forward together. As the day of the grand reopening of the Maplewood Library approached, the town buzzed with anticipation. The renovated building stood as a testament to the community's resilience and newfound unity. Banners announcing the event fluttered in the breeze, and volunteers scurried about, putting the finishing touches on the exhibits and arrangements. On the morning of the reopening, Nathaniel found himself standing outside the library, taking in the scene. The once dilapidated building now gleamed, its facade restored to its former glory. As he admired the transformation, he heard familiar footsteps approaching. "It's quite a sight, isn't it?" Zoe said, coming to stand beside him. Nathaniel nodded, a mix of emotions playing across his face. "It's more than I ever could have hoped for." Their moment of reflection was interrupted by the arrival of an unexpected visitor. A sleek black car pulled up, and out stepped an older man in an expensive suit. Nathaniel's expression hardened as he recognized the figure. "Dad," he said, his voice tense. "What are you doing here?" Richard Johnson, Nathaniel's father, approached with a stern expression. "I came to see what all the fuss was about," he said, his eyes scanning the building and the gathering crowd. and to put an end to this nonsense. Zoe instinctively stepped closer to Nathaniel, sensing the confrontation brewing. "Mr. Johnson," she began, "I don't think you understand what's happening here." Richard's gaze snapped to Zoe. "I understand perfectly. My son is throwing away generations of wealth on some misguided attempt at redemption." As their voices raised, people began to take notice. Margaret, who had been greeting early arrivals, made her way over to the group. "So you're Richard Johnson," she said, her voice calm but firm. "I've been waiting a long time to meet you." Richard looked at her dismissively. "And you are?" "I'm Margaret Carter," she replied, "and I have something you need to see." Before Richard could protest, Margaret produced the old journal and the photograph of Alexander Johnson and her great-grandfather. As she began to explain the history behind these artifacts, a crowd gathered around them, including George Hawkins and other prominent town members. Richard's face paled as he listened to Margaret's account and examined the evidence. This can't be true," he stammered. Nathaniel stepped forward. "It is true, Dad, and it's time for us to face our family's past and make things right." The confrontation had drawn the attention of local media who had come to cover the library reopening. Cameras turned towards the unfolding drama, capturing the moment for all of Maplewood to witness. Seeing the cameras, Richard attempted to regain his composure. "This changes nothing," he declared. "I won't allow the Johnson family name to be tarnished by these fairy tales." It was at this moment that Tom Foster pushed through the crowd. "Mr. Johnson," he said, his voice steady, "I used to think like you. I was angry, suspicious of any attempt to change things. But I've seen what your son and Zoe have accomplished here. They're not tarnishing your family name, they're redeeming it." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the gathered crowd. One by one, townspeople began to speak up, sharing stories of how the library project and Nathaniel's efforts had positively impacted their lives. Richard looked around, bewildered by the outpouring of support. His stern facade began to crumble as the weight of the moment sank in. Nathaniel approached his father, placing a hand on his shoulder. "Dad, this isn't about erasing our past. It's about building a better future, for all of us." For a long moment, Richard stood silent, conflict evident in his eyes. Then, slowly, he nodded. I need time to process all this, but perhaps I've been too hasty in my judgment." A collective sigh of relief seemed to pass through the crowd. The tension that had built up dissipated, replaced by a renewed sense of excitement for the day's event. As Richard retreated to his car, promising to return for a longer discussion, Mayor Thompson stepped forward. "Well, folks," he said with a smile, "I think it's time we officially reopen the Maplewood Library." Cheers erupted as Nathaniel and Zoe, flanked by Margaret and other community leaders, cut the ribbon across the library entrance. As the doors swung open, revealing the beautifully restored interior and the new historical exhibits, there was a palpable sense of a new chapter beginning for Maplewood. Inside, visitors marveled at the seamless blend of modern amenities and preserved historical features. The exhibit detailing the town's complex history, including the Johnson-Carter connection, drew particular interest. As the day wore on, Nathaniel and Zoe found a quiet moment amidst the celebration. They stood in front of the photograph of their great-grandfathers, their hands intertwined. "We did it," Zoe said softly. Nathaniel squeezed her hand. "No, we're just getting started." Looking out over the crowded library filled with the sounds of excitement and discovery, they both felt a deep sense of accomplishment and hope. The journey had been difficult, filled with revelations and confrontations, but it had led to this moment of unity and renewal. As the sun began to set on Maplewood, casting a warm glow through the library windows, it was clear that while the town's story was far from over, a new and promising chapter had begun. The library stood not just as a repository of books, but as a symbol of reconciliation, progress, and the power of facing the past to build a better future.